chair of the CBER, Professor P.R. Datta, my session chair, distinguished guests, colleagues, and all the distinguished participants. My name is Professor Sarat C. I currently work with as the Director Research and Publications with the C3S Business School, Spain. I'm also a director with another business school in Barcelona, Spain, called the Aspire Business School. The title is Spending Ackers on Your Values, the Ethical Consumerism Beyond Its Current Form. Now, that acker seems to be a little bit of informal term, but I think probably that still would go with what we intend to achieve out of this discourse. Here, some of the things that we definitely would be dealing with is the consequent, some of the key words which would come during the course of the discussions is a deontology, natural capitalism, there's something related to user-generated ethical reviews, and there is consequentialism and quite a few others. And a lot of terms which Immanuel Kant used, and I will be borrowing heavily from his some of the seminal work, like the grounding of the metaphysics, etc. Now, the next slide, if you really can come to, please, the first slide. And that's the abstract, the first slide, where we primarily talks about the concept of the ethical consumerism, which is that how the consumerism comes to term with ethics, and how such a discourse actually falls under the concept of ethical consumerism. And that can be traced to some form of consumer activism, where people or the consumers can come to know about the abuse of the child labor, the animals, and they all are condemned to very deplorable working conditions or in a large scale of damage that is inflicted on the environment. And that is what we know as the carbon footprint of a product. So this is very, very much in the current discourse, which is known as some kind of a political activism. So that is based on the premise that the buyers in the markets consume not only the goods, but also implicitly the process used to produce them. Hence, the consumption is a political act that sanctions the values embodied in the product, sometimes visible, sometimes invisible, or sometimes some way encrypted into the product informations. So today, in many cases, the consumers have provided a very criteria-based ethical and environmental sustainability ratings, which further influence the way the ethical sourcing-based commodities are traded in the market. So the big-ticket news agencies such as the Bloomberg or the Reuters provide environmental, social, and governance ratings directly to the financial data screens of the teeming populations of the stock market traders. Now, these consumers and traders are informed by the ethical reviews of the products that are quite wide-ranging. There is the media or the watchdog or the organizations control reviews to user-generated ethical reviews. So the labeling and the certification of these products sometimes help the reviews. Some products are labeled in a ways that indicate that they were produced in line with certain ethical values. For instance, the QE may be labeled as organic. A piece of textiles may be labeled child labor free, or a paper which is about 100% recycled, etc. So the whole way, I'm still very much on this purpose of the research, which I mentioned that, as you see on the screen, that deontology and consequentialism. So you'll find some strands of these both concepts of deontology, Kantian deontology and consequentialism, very much in this current discourse. I'd like to quote John McCarthy and his argument that all purchasing decisions imply some moral choice, and that there is no purchasing that is not ultimately moral in nature. Not all economists dealing with the consumer science will concur with this. further, there are always some trust criteria, the creditworthiness or the implied warranty, that are considered to be a part of any purchasing or sourcing decisions. However, these terms refer to a very broad systems of the guidance that would ideally cause any purchasing decisions to disqualify offered products or services based on non-price criteria that affect the moral rather than the functional liabilities of the entire production process. So, another gentleman, the Paul Hawken, a proponent of the natural capitalism, refers to the comprehensive outcomes of the production services as opposed to the cumulative process outcomes of using products of such services. So often the moral criteria are a part of a shift from the commodity markets towards a service economy, where all activities from growing to harvesting, to processing, to the delivery are considered part of the value chain of which the consumers are responsible. Since consumption-related ethical concerns result from a personal beliefs and societal influences, not from the law, so it limits the legitimization of the regulators and related bodies to impose certain dimensions of the ethical behavior, or whether the consumer law is the appropriate mechanism to achieve such purposes. So the whole paper, the whole discourse actually sort of intends to locate the ethical consumerism, whether it is appropriate mechanism to achieve such purposes. Now, the purposes that we mentioned is deontology. It will probably will try to discontinue and try to deconstruct and explain that a little further. Now, something I really like all these flow to go with me on a test like this. Now, what I suggest to do with the Deadbeat Test is that I mean just acting out, lying on a deathbed and not overcommitting ourselves to attaining such a physical condition. Here, this is what a macabre scenes may look like. You have lived all your life as a consumer now, and forced with the final moment of clarity and reflection before the darkness falls. So now we reflect on our actions as a consumer, the choices that we have made as a consumer, and how the choices had a bearing on your lives, families, friends, people at large, or even the environment per se. If you now have to go back to your life that you have lived so far, think in terms of a carbon footprint that you have generated. Would you make those choices? You think that you would have made those choices a little differently? So what is that threadbare, essential life we always needed but ignored? We are swamped or inundated by overwhelming choices. So the deathbed test is almost like, Rene Descartes would call it a self-punishing past meditations, I would say, a very philosophical treatise, and that's the foundation of our modern philosophy, made up of 6 meditations. So on the first philosophy, in which the existence of the God and the immorality of the soul are demonstrated, so it was such a rigorous self-flagellation in which Descartes first discards all the belief in things that are not absolutely certain, and then attempts to establish what we what can be known for sure. And so he wrote the meditation as if he had meditated for 6 days, and each meditation refers to at least one as extra day. So the first meditation subtitled "What Can Be Labeled into Doubt" opens up with the, let us stay with that deadbeat test, please. So the first meditation subtitled "What Can Be Called Into a Doubt" opens the meditator reflecting on the number of the falsehood that he had believed during his life, and on the subsequent faultiness of the body of the knowledge that he has built up from these falsehoods. So he has resolved to sweep away all these things that he knows and to start again from the foundations, building of his knowledge. So once more, or on more certain grounds. So he has seated himself alone by the fire, free of all the worries, so that he can demolish his former opinions with care. Now, putting that in the perspective of a consumer, now think about that, what you have done as a consumer all your life, you see, and how many child labors have been exploited in this process of your choices. And that really something would take you in that direction of the Descartes of the first meditations. So when our discourse is about the ethical consumption and how a phenomenon goes down a long way from identifying the connections between the product, where and how this product came into being, and in what context it has been produced, to the way it is distributed, consumed, and or if required, how it is disposed of, such as how it recycled or goes into a landfill area. And there are many questions the ethical consumption points out. The way a 21st century consumer consumes or shops a product, or the lifestyle choices that we make as an individual as a part of this consumption process, and the possible effect that such consumptions would have on immediate communities or people at large. So sometimes we really ignore, turn a blind eye to this. So the ethical consumerism has a pointed swipe at this fashion industry. Today, you know the word of fast fashion, and so much of these actually go into a landfill area. So we probably spend we cannot even imagine that the environment hazard that it can create, or it is already creating. So the ethical consumerism is pointing. It has sort of kind of a depositions against the fashion industry, and where the latter produces low quality garments meant to capitalize on new trends and passing fads. And now this practice enforces very tight guidelines for the workers and spikes the amount of the waste the garment industry engenders. Now, the ethical consumerism underpins a form of a political activism that is premised on the belief that the buyers in markets consume not only goods, but also implicitly the process that put in place to produce them from the point of view of the ethical consumerism, or the latter is a political act that censures the values embodied in making of such a product. Now, by opting for such products, now we all our life, we have done that crime, that heinous crime. It is not a misdemeanor. I call it a kind of it can be equated to a kind of a culpable homicide, that by opting for such products over the others, or even whether we buy at all, the consumers can accept or repudiate particular environmental and labor practices or make other value claims based on ethical values they espouse. Now, exercising this choice in the manner engender incentives for the producers to make production practices compatible to consumer values. If you can come to the literature review, that's probably the next slide. This is a paradigm that I always talk about. After this, there is a literature review that we live in a sinkhole paradigm called the consumerism. And I'm sure that, there's some of the eye-grabbing things that you would say, what is the ritual of consumerism? Now, who is being sacrificed? In that sacrificial altar, who all are being sacrificed? So this is something that you compare this with your earlier Deadbeat Test, and how do you amend your choices now? If you can go to the next slide of the literature review. Now, in this literature review, it is kind of a deontological argument, which I mentioned about the Kant underpinning his theory of the ethics that clearly unfolds a consumer's intention or the motive of his or her actions over the consequence of the same. So no matter how good or bad it is, we cannot get out of it. At the end, we have to face the consequence of such an actions. So Kant has given an explanation of such a thing, the deontological argument, and that is what he says is a transition from the common rational knowledge of morals to the philosophical treatise. And that is in one of his seminal book, which is known as The Grounding for the Metaphysics of Morals. It is also available in 2 other titles, but initially it was published in Germany as The Grounding for the Metaphysics of the Morals. So essentially, this it affirms that something is good in itself when it is intrinsically good, and that is good without qualifications. So when the addition of that thing never makes the situations ethically worse, or nothing will. So people act out of the respect for the moral law when they act in some way because they have a duty to do so. Thus, the only thing that is truly good in itself is a goodwill. And a goodwill is only good when the willer chooses to do something because it is that the person's duty or out of the respect for the law. So he defines this concept as the concept of concept of oath, which thwarts my self-law. So in consumerism perspective, the goodwill, both in its meaning and functionality, is distorted. So all the stakeholders in the consumerism process deliberate on calculating goodwill in a particular manner, the fair value of assets and the liabilities of the acquired business. That is added to the fair value of the business assets and liabilities. So the excess price over this fair value of the net identifiable asset is termed as goodwill. But that's something, how distorted the Kant's original idea of a goodwill is in the context of consumerism. So to all the stakeholders of the consumer world who are always taking a consequentialist perspective, can be referred as indulge in wrongdoing according to Kant. So since it neglects Kant's suggested existence of deontology. So following Kantian deontology, Tanner and a few other co-authors, they affirm that the people are sensitive to moral duties that acquire prohibit certain behaviors irrespective of the consequences. So they affirm that people holding protected values increased attention to the acts versus the omissions or the less attention to the outcomes, thus attempting to gain an insight into the role of deontological versus the consequentialist models of thought, and what we know as the protected values on framing affects and the act versus the omission of choices. Now, in the modifications of these, the two authors, as I mentioned, the Vasky and the Kahneman, they said that the risky choice framing paradigm of Tanner and his co-authors manipulated the framing of the outcomes. Now, the framing of the outcomes, he says, positive and negative, as well as whether the certain outcomes was associated with an act or inaction. So the main results suggest that the act versus omission tendencies is linked to the deontological focus and the protected values. So the framing effects on the other hand are driven by the consequentialist test for focus. Now, a risky choice framing, which purported the experimental participations with multiple scenarios, noted that with each framing conditions, the CR and the risky options have the same expected value. Now, what is expected value is actually calculated by outcomes payout by the probability of its occurring. So therefore, by choosing such an option over the risky alternative with the same expected value, participants seem to exhibit the risk aversions. Now, that's something that I would not like to dwell more on that, but I would like to say that the Vasky and the Kahneman's experiment arise in two questions, primary questions. Now, what are those questions? One is, of course, a descriptive questions, that why is decision-making of a consumer is sensitive to frame? Normative questions can be that should it be, and is it consistent with the rational behavior, or does it reveal a flaw in the human reasoning about the risky choices? So it is standardly assumed that the framing effects are inconsistent with the rational decision making. In particular, they are perceived to violate a fundamental tenet in the rational choice theory, the principle of the description of invariance. Now, theory of invariance, it is where the property of remaining unchanged regardless of the changes in the conditions of the measurement. So in the rational choice theory, which origin can be traced to Adam Smith's seminal work, The Wealth of the Nation, that propounds that a consumer will perform a cost-benefit analysis to determine whether an option is right for him or her. So the choice posits that the consumer's self-driven rational actions will help to improve the economy, and such a choice underpins three concepts. Now, what are the three concepts? One is the rational actors, the second is the self-interest, and the third one is the invisible hand. Now, invisible hand is very famously known as the Adam Smith's the wealth of the nation's invisible hand. Now, the psychological principles that govern this perception of decision-making problems and the evaluations of the probabilities and the outcomes produce predictable shifts of preference when the same problem is framed in different ways. Now, what does it mean? And I will conclude on this, at least on this literature. Will take a little more time to conclude my presentation, but that the reversal of the preference are demonstrated in the choices regarding the monetary outcomes, and both hypothetical and real. So the effects of the frames on the preference are compared to the effects of the perspectives on the perceptual appearance. So the dependence of the preference on the formulations of the decision problems is a significant concern for the theory of rational choice. Now, the framing of the acts and the outcomes can also reflect the acceptance or the rejection of the responsibility for particular consequences. And the deliberate manipulations of the framing is commonly used as an instrument of self-control. Now, when framing influences the experience of the consequences, the adoption of the decision frame is an ethically significant act. Now, if you come to the methodology, which is my next slide, and I'll now quickly run through. I do not know how much time we have. How much time would you have approximately?
Sarat, you're okay at the moment. You're in plenty of time.
Okay, sure. Thank you, sir. So now coming to this methodology, now is method to this consumerism madness. But no, it's all about that how mad we are, or on whether there is a pattern of this madness, and how do you investigate this pattern of madness? Now, I say that our ethical consumerism can be woven around these Kant's three significant formulations of the categorical imperative. It is very famously known as categorical imperative. That can be a guiding template for the consumer rational choice by underpinning the ethical consumerism. Now, the three are all there on your screen. I rather would point out these three very, very key points of this methodology, where you would see that there is something to do with the maxim by which you can also will that it will become a universal law. And if you come to the second one, that the way you always treat humanity, whether in your own person or in the person of any other, never simply as a mean, but always as at the same time as an end. And this is what we have been doing all along as a consumer. Third is every rational being must also so act as if he or she were through his or her maxim, always a legislating member in a universal kingdom of ends. Now, Kant actually is arguing that the only absolutely, and then that probably I'm taking it as a method which has survived the test of the time, that the only absolutely good thing is a goodwill. And so a single determining factor of whether an action is morally right is the goodwill or the motive of the person doing it. So if they are acting on a bad maxim, I will lie, then their action is wrong, even if some good consequences come of it. Now, Kant's goodness without qualification, and so called the morally good quality or intention, it has a very typical German tongue twister. My German is not that good, still I'll try to say that this is called Gesinnung. That needs to remain in a consumer. Now, how such a method can be applied to a consumer rational choice theory can have very varied opinions. At its most basic level of interpretations, consumer behavior is rational if it is goal-oriented, reflective, and consistent. And when I said consistent, it means that across time and different choice situations. Now, this all sit at a variance or at an odd with the behavior that is random, impulsive, conditioned and adapted by the under evaluative imitations. So, so the basic premise of this rational choice theory is that the decisions made by the individual actors will collectively produce a very aggregate social behavior. Now, will the collective behavior can remain moral? I do not know. When certain moral behaviors exercised while making these choices, I do not know. The rational choice also assumes that individuals have preferences out of available choice alternatives. Now, these preferences are assumed to be complete and transitive. Now, the completeness refers to the individual being able to say which of the options they prefer. Now, you are as an individual consumer prefer A over B, or A or B over A, or are indifferent to the both. Now, alternatively, the transitivity is where the individual weakly prefers option A over B, or weakly prefers option B over C, leading to the conclusion that the individual weakly prefers A over C. So the rational choice, the rational agent, will then perform their own cost-benefit analysis using a very variety of the criterion to perform their self-determined best choice of action. So one of the variant of the rationality is the instrumental rationality, which contains achieving a goal using a most cost-effective method without reflecting on the ordinariness of that goal. Now we have the author called Duncan Sneddon, who says that the goals are not that restricted to self-regarding selfish or material interest. They also includes other regarding altruistic as well as the normative and the ideational goal. And these things do exist. And the rational choice theory doesn't assert to articulate the choice process, but rather it assists to predict the outcome and the pattern of the choice. Now, it is consequently presupposed that the consumer is self-interested, or being there is something a term called homo economius. Here, the consumer arrives at a decision that maximizes personal advantage by balancing cost or benefits. Now, the Kant affirms that with the exception of a goodwill, all goods are qualified. Qualified, what Kant interprets that those goods are good insofar as they presuppose or derive their goodness from something else. For example, wealth can be tremendously good if it is employed for human welfare, but or even organizing a seminar like this. But if it can be fatal if a deceitful or a scrupulous mind is behind it. Now, likewise, we repeatedly aspire intelligence and accept it to be good, but we undoubtedly would not take the intelligence of an evil genius to be good. So the goodwill, by contrast, is good in itself. Now, the Kant says a goodwill is not good because what it effects or accomplishes because of its fitness to attain certain proposed end, but only because of its violation, that is, it is good in itself. So now we really have to see that, how our choices actually fitting into all this. Now, if you go to the next slide, please. Next slide.
Professor Gass, 4 minutes left.
Okay, 4 minutes left. So, so this is something that I got a long way to go, and but I rather would say that I prefer to come to the end, so to be on time. But what I mean to primarily say that you know where to ground this discourse. My primary difficulty of wading through this discourse is how do you marry the Kantian's deontology or the categorical imperative, a goodwill, or the concept of a goodwill, to the rational choice theory. So that's the entire way, but somehow I probably have made some progress, but probably not good enough. But my future direction of this research should be that the entire significance of the emotions in decision-making has generally been ignored by the rational choice theory. And that's something that I really find, despite all the hype about the rational choice theory, this is where we lack. And which actually pivots from the key question that how the ethical consumerism functions. Okay, you say that this functions in certain way, but how it? So that probably would not have a very definite answer or a conclusive answer. So moreover, the emotional choice theorist, which I so far have ignored all through in the discourse, but that's something that I suddenly realized while writing through this paper, that they contend that the rational choice paradigm has awkwardness and its own complexities, incorporating emotions into the models because it cannot account for the social nature of the emotions. Now, I again try to emphasize on this point, social nature of emotions. Even though emotions are felt by consumers at large, psychologists and even the sociologists postulate that the emotions cannot be severed from the social environment in which these emotive feelings arise. Now, emotions are inextricably intertwined with people's social norms, identities, and considered to be beyond the scope of all posited rational choice models. However, this is such a crucial part of the ethical consumerism or any reference to the consumerism. There must be new ways to account for this end. Hopefully, I'd be able to do this. My conclusion, if you really can bring up my last slide, and so that I'm within the stipulated time. The last slide, please. So that's that's it. But I say that is ethical consumerism a solution to creating an egalitarian society and eradicating poverty? No one knows for sure, but prima facie, the way I feel it, that ethical consumerism is to be considered or deemed as a very authentic long-term solution to attaining equality and eradicating poverty. However, currently a handful of organizations which are sincerely practicing this are beset with the price mechanism aspect, the price mechanism distortions and the efficiency of incentivizing the corrosions that only depend the causes of the entrenched structural poverty, and that may also fall into some terms with or symptoms to arrive at effective solutions. So an ethically informed consumer, I must say, is not merely buying a product, but is actually inheriting a legacy, the history of associated with such a product. Please try to understand. In the first slide, we talked about child labor and the massive destruction of the ecosystem that we have done through our purchases, and how he or she, as a consumer, would carry forward this legacy to have a bearing on his life or her life and people and environment around him or her. So rarely people recognize the power and the ability they have to shape destiny of this product, and even the force the producer to be more sustainable, ethical, and accountable. And I think that's probably a lot of thoughts for us. And we must carry forward, but this is something that I'd like to conclude by saying that we need to find new ways to postulate that emotion cannot be severed from the social environment. How do you account for that? The social nature of the emotions. Thank you.